Imagine everything it takes to design and build a race car. The sheer number of skills you would need to develop to create a chassis, fit an engine to it, fabricate the body, and then actually get the thing moving. And if that's not hard enough, now imagine you get the car out on track and it keeps trying to fly into the air. Think of all the work you would have to do to make changes, the data you would need to collect and analyze, and the solutions you would have to engineer. Now, imagine doing that for the very first time. No one has taught you how to do this. You don't have a computer to help you figure it out. It's just you, a couple friends, and a big idea. What I've just described is, in effect, the founding of Jim Hall's career. This iconic racing driver and automotive engineer completely changed the landscape of motorsport with his Chaparral racing machines, many of which debuted features like composite monocoque chassis, movable aerodynamics, and semi-automatic transmissions well before anyone else in the world. And yes, that includes over in Formula One. In fact, many F1 engineers look to Jim Hall for inspiration. But in this episode, it's not Jim Hall's incredible career or the legacy he's left on racing that I really want to discuss. I instead want to focus on the story of his incredible Chaparral 2J, a racing machine so comprehensively quick that the FIA stepped in to kill it. A machine that wasn't even racing in a directly FIA-sanctioned series. This is the story of the move that began the demise of the Can-Am Challenge, the most innovative racing series in history. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. If you were to ask an iconic Formula One designer like Adrian Newey or Gordon Murray to name some of their engineering heroes, Jim Hall will inevitably end up on that list. If you ask any American race fan of a certain age to name their favorite childhood race car, there's a good chance they're going to name a Chaparral. And if you page through the F1 history books, you'll come across one innovation after another founded by one quiet man who never gets much credit and who implemented those innovations on his race cars ages before. If you guess that that man was Jim Hall and those cars were his Chaparrals, then I'd say you're catching on. But before I delve too deep into the story of the Chaparral 2J and its influence on the death of the Can-Am series, we need to talk about Jim Hall. We need to understand who he really is. Jim Hall was born in Abilene, Texas on July 23, 1935, though his family soon after moved to Colorado and also spent a decent amount of time in New Mexico. Hall's father, Ellis, was a geologist who struck it big with a company he founded called Condor Petroleum, an oil and gas exploration firm. His mother had a master's degree in English from Columbia University and met Ellis Hall in Guadalajara while he was traveling for business and she was teaching English. The pair married in 1927. Hall was the third of 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, each born 3 years apart. You might expect that Hall had it good, growing up in a family that had founded a multi-million-dollar company in the throes of the oil boom. And in a lot of ways, you would be correct. In Colorado, Jim Hall and his siblings could get a great education and live a fairly comfortable life in an era where the Great Depression and the onset of World War II had ravaged the lives of other folks who were less well off. Hall grew up skiing during the Colorado winters before summering on his family's massive ranch. He picked up a love of aircraft from his father, who was an avid pilot, and was encouraged to tear apart any and all of the family's appliances just to see how they worked. But just after World War II ended, Hall's mother Teresa fell ill with breast cancer. Though she underwent surgery to have a lump removed, the cancer metastasized, and she left first for Chicago and then Albuquerque to pursue an aggressive treatment. When it was clear that she wasn't going to get better, Teresa Hall shuttered herself away from her family, not wanting her children to see her dying. When she finally passed in 1948, Jim Hall was not yet a teenager, and it had been over a year since the last time he'd seen his mother. Hall's older sister Betty took on a mothering role as the family moved permanently to Albuquerque, while Jim developed a love of speed. Yes, he adored flying just like his father, but he was also coming of age in the early stages of the hot rod era. Living just off Route 66, Hall admired the gorgeous pre-war cars that had been transformed into slick speed machines as they passed through town. At 14 years old, he bought his first car, a Ford Model A, and earned his driver's license. He took flying lessons, tinkered with his car, and got a job working with his father in the oil fields. And all of that money that he earned went right into his latest automobile purchases. Soon after, his father married a woman named Virginia Hockenhull, the daughter of a former governor. As he entered high school, Hall added another all-consuming interest to his resume. He took a physics class that changed his life, and his professor recommended he take a college course on aviation weather. He followed an interest in geology just like his father, and was advised to apply to Caltech, the California Institute of Technology. He did, and he was accepted. Before he took off for college, Jim married his high school sweetheart Nancy Fishback and spent his summer with her in Albuquerque as several members of his family, his father, his stepmother, his sister, his stepsister, and a few of their friends, jetted off for a trip to Alaska in Ellis Hall's own plane, a de Havilland Dove 2A. They never returned. It took almost a month for the wreckage of the plane to be found, and it was clear that there would have been no survivors. Investigators assumed the de Havilland had come apart in mid-air, and there was nothing Ellis Hall could do to save it. He died, along with several other key members of Jim Hall's family. Hall himself was just 18 years old, heading off to California with his pregnant wife to begin an intensive study program. In his typical reserved fashion, Hall's only comment on the massive tragedies he'd suffered over the previous 5 years was, "I got to be an adult pretty quick." Hall and his brothers, Dick and Chuck, inherited a windfall from their father. Other members of their extended family helped the young man sell off Condor, Ellis Hall's company, in order to pay the taxes and legal bills and pay off the shareholders, all of these things that arose in the process after his death. They also helped the brothers establish their own smaller oil company with the funds that were left over. It was a smart move. The Hall brothers were 14, 18, and 23 at the time of their father's death, and investing their money rather than carelessly spending it set them up for the rest of their lives and enabled Jim Hall to later fund his aspirations in racing. But all of that was still in the future. At 18 years old, Hall had lost both of his parents, inherited huge sums of money that needed to be invested wisely, and had become a father, all while trying to pursue a degree at one of America's elite universities. Geology proved to be a challenge, if only because Hall's previous education hadn't quite prepared him for the rigors of the system. He'd never heard of calculus when he arrived at Caltech, but that was something that his private school-educated peers had already started to master. So as he went into his second year of school after having faltered in his first, Hall changed majors. He took up engineering. He also took up racing. Jim's older brother Dick had become interested in motorsport and had entered an amateur 1954 race at Fort Sumner before inviting his younger brother along. In an open practice session for novices, Dick handed Jim his helmet and let his brother hit the track. They were so impressed with his speed that Jim actually then started the race, even though he wasn't able to finish because a fuel line had burst. It was a life-changing moment. Because Dick had been diagnosed with ever-worsening rheumatoid arthritis that ultimately led to his suicide, his racing career quickly stalled out, but that never stopped him from supporting his younger brother and helping encourage Jim to pursue a career in motorsport. Dick effectively bought Jim a Ferrari 750 Monza. Technically, they were partners in the purchasing agreement, but Jim didn't put up any money for the car. The first time he took that car out onto the track, he won. Hall continued racing throughout college, and as he prepared to graduate, it looked as if he would have it pretty good. He'd been recommended for and offered a job to join General Motors in order to work on the Chevrolet Corvette, so as he wrapped up his degree, Jim was figuring out how he was about to move off to Detroit. However, a massive recession had struck the auto industry, putting an end to new hiring. Jim was supposed to move to Detroit in June of 1957. In March, he received a letter from GM that informed him they wouldn't be able to take him on. Once again, Jim's older brother stepped in. Dick Hall had struck up a promising friendship with a gearhead who had just opened a shop in Texas that effectively imported and tuned British cars for interested buyers. It wouldn't pay well, but it would keep Jim involved in both the automotive and motorsport worlds. He'd get to move back to Texas, and hey, maybe he'd get to learn something in the process as well. So, Jim Hall accepted a job at a little firm called Carroll Shelby Sports Cars. Even if he wasn't making a ton of money, Jim Hall had a chance to drive some of the world's best sports cars and to make critical connections with drivers, mechanics, and engineers. He also learned that the best marketing strategy to sell a car was to take that car out to a race and win it. By the time he got back to the shop, it was almost guaranteed someone was ready to scoop up the car. The races he competed in got bigger and bigger, with fields of internationally recognized racers like John Fitch, Olivier Gendabien, the Rodriguez brothers, and more. But Jim's successes on the track were not mimicked at home. Jim and Nancy divorced, and Nancy took their 3 children with her as she got on her way to her next marriage. Meanwhile, Jim met a woman named Sandy Carroll. The two would marry, and Sandy would become one of the most critical figures in Hall's later successes. But perhaps the race that launched Hall into international stardom better than any other was the 1960 United States Grand Prix. Yes, a Formula One race. Hill entered the event at Riverside International Raceway with an old Lotus Climax that he'd worked on himself, alongside drivers in better equipment and with far more experience. He still managed to finish 7th, and that was in large part only because a stub axle broke on his car. Otherwise, he was set to finish 5th. It was a hugely impressive debut. Paired with his ongoing successes in American sports car racing and his increasing forays into serious car modification, Hall was on his way to becoming a force to be reckoned with in the United States racing scene. And that's why Dick Trautman and Tom Barnes reached out to Jim Hall. Trautman and Barnes were something of a dynamic motorsport duo, developing some of the incredible race cars that would compete at events like the Indianapolis 500. They were also 2 of the first people recruited by Lance Reventlow when the entrepreneur began building his Scarab sports cars. The Trautman-Barnes Scarab did fine, but the 2 men thought they could make it even better. That car, which they called their Riverside Racer, soon became one of the first to carry the Chaparral name. The Trautman-Barnes offer came at a perfect time. Jim Hall had been racing a Tipo 61 birdcage Maserati that, despite extensive modifications of his own design, was being outclassed by newer machinery. From that point on, I realized that I didn't want to buy last year's Lotus, Hall said. I wanted something that was better. The Scarabs were going well, and Trautman and Barnes worked there, so I made that deal with Dick Trautman. It was the first step on a path toward greatness. If you're looking for incredible, authentic motorsport merch with a retro flair that looks unlike anything else you're going to see in the stores, make sure you check out Homefield Apparel. The company is based right in Speedway, Indiana, and it has developed a few exceptional racing-related merch lines this year that celebrate some of the greatest motorsport teams and racing events in all of American history. Make sure to stop by the link in my bio to check out the goods, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 to get 15% off your first purchase. When Jim Kaiser was offered a role as competition director at the Sports Car Club of America, he had to think hard about whether or not he wanted to take on that challenge. The former amateur racer had been hired by executive director John Bishop, who wanted them in tandem to develop a new sports car series. See, America already had plenty of sports car racing series, and the pinnacle of that discipline in the United States was the United States Road Racing Championship. But in Bishop's eyes, the USRRC wasn't all that thrilling. The racing was good, but no one was talking about the series with the same starry-eyed wonder that race fans talked about the Indy 500 or the 24 Hours of Le Mans. No one was really claiming that the USRRC was a top-tier international caliber sport. However, there were a few top-tier international caliber sports car races in America. The Players 200 at Mosport, the Los Angeles Times Grand Prix at Riverside, and the Monterey Grand Prix at Laguna Seca. These events, outside of the USRRC Championship, were the only sports car races in America drawing in huge fields of international talent. And according to Kaiser and Bishop, there were 3 big reasons why. The cars were faster, the races were scheduled in the gaps of the international calendar, and the prize money was real good. But let's just say we were to elaborate on that mindset. How would we go about doing it? Kaiser and Bishop started off with the big problem, the schedule. If you wanted a Jim Clark or a Phil Hill to race in your series in the United States, you had to make sure that they could actually, race there, that they weren't contracted to compete somewhere else. So the 2 men called around and built up a calendar that took place in the fall, after the international racing calendar had already wrapped up. Great, that was done, wrapped up. Now they had to ask, how do you create faster cars? For Kaiser, the answer was simple. Regulate nothing. Okay, well maybe you needed to conform to some basic safety requirements and have 2 seats, but that was it. No engine displacement rules, no classes, no restrictions on vehicle size or weight, no need to build a car that could fit an arbitrary piece of luggage in its trunk. All the rules dictating the sport fit on 1 page of legal pad. And let's see what the competitors will bring. All that was left was money, and Kaiser had some ideas about that too. See, back in the 1950s and 60s, you didn't get that much money for winning a race. Instead, big-time drivers made a career out of appearance fees. That meant that a wildly popular international star like Jim Clark could show up at, say, the Los Angeles Times Grand Prix at Riverside, and he would get heaps of money just for being there. He could finish dead last, and that didn't matter. He made a tidy sum, and the less well-known racers were handed crumbs, no matter how well they finished. So Kaiser decided he only wanted to offer prize money, as in, you don't get paid a cent for showing up. You only get paid based on how you perform. So let's say a star like Jim Clark shows up at a Can-Am race at Riverside. He's not walking away with a single cent until he crosses the finish line, and his paycheck will only be as big as his finishing position dictates. That's it. It was a bold strategy at the time, and Kaiser knew it could turn off some potential European competitors right from the get-go. It cost a lot of money to ship equipment to America. Why bother coming to a race if you couldn't guarantee you'd be paid a certain amount? Well, Kaiser did something about that too. In its first season, Can-Am would award an eye-watering $360,000 in total prize money over the course of the year. Adjusted for inflation today, that is $3.5 million. Yeah, that might be enough to convince some of the bigger European firms to jet off to America for a few months. If they could walk away with the title, they'd also walk away with a very tidy profit. If they showed up and bombed, well, they could probably, at the very least, pay their bills before heading home. And just like that, the Canadian American Challenge Cup, or Can-Am, was born. On September 11, 1966, the inaugural race of the series kicked off at Mont-Tremblant for the Players 200, and American motorsport was about to change forever. The Chaparral 2J was not a handsome car. It looked a little bit like a shoebox with a sculpted front nose and a squared-off rear end that someone had stuck some fans into. The center section was never painted white like the rest of the car. Instead, it boasted a bare aluminum body. At first glance, the Chaparral 2J also looked like the antithesis of aerodynamic efficiency. It was the kind of race car that you could only imagine lumbering across a track surface like a beast of burden. But looks aren't everything, and the moment the Chaparral 2J hit the track, everyone knew they were witnessing history. But let's back up a few steps so I can tell you how we got here. We last left Jim Hall when he partnered with Dick Troutman and Tom Barnes, picking up the scraps of Lance Reventlo's Scarab to create something new, a Chaparral. But between the late 50s and the introduction of the Chaparral 2J in 1970, a whole lot happened. In 1963, Jim Hall contested a full Formula One season with the British Racing Partnership Team, which fielded an out-of-date Lotus 24 chassis powered by a BRM V8. In 9 races, Hall finished in the points twice and secured a 12th overall finish in the World Drivers' Championship. He continued on a streak of successes until a terrible accident forced him out from behind the wheel. That being said, he was still building cars. His machines had contested the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and his Chaparral 2D took a shocking victory at the 1966 Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers, where European pundits expected the American outfit to embarrass itself. Instead, it became the first American car to win a major European road race in over 40 years. The Chaparral outfit had also struck up close relationships with both General Motors and Firestone. Back in the late 1950s, General Motors was one of several auto companies that agreed to withdraw from racing. The Automobile Manufacturers Association, a trade group representing U.S. car makers, had instituted a ban on factory-supported racing. Ford had already broken that agreement, but GM still kept its participation in motorsport on the down low. The company's primary interest in Hall and the Chaparral team, though, was for a totally different purpose than racing. See, the rear-engine Chevrolet Corvair had become the center of a serious lawsuit that alleged the company had knowingly released an unsafe vehicle prone to failures that would not have happened in any other car. Suddenly, one lawsuit turned into hundreds. Rather than simply pay out all the lawsuits and damage its reputation, GM instead embarked on a serious effort to counter the allegations against it by comprehensively studying vehicle dynamics. Frank Winchell, Chevrolet's research and development boss, was assigned to spearhead this effort, and he recruited the Chaparral team to help him out. After all, GM needed to recruit a third party in order to avoid allegations of bias, and Hall's outfit out in Midland was pretty far away from any prying eyes. That meant that Hall and his crew were employed to conduct tests both of the Corvair and of all its competitors, gathering data to comprehensively prove that a rear-engine car was no more dangerous than any other car on the road. Chaparral did the testing, but GM provided the supplies required to gather, log, and analyze data. As you might imagine, all of that equipment and all the innovative testing methods benefited the race team. Chaparral was assembling a world-class knowledge of vehicle dynamics, and it could implement those findings into its own cars. And since Chaparral had developed a great test facility in the form of Hall's Rattlesnake Raceway out in Midland, the team also took on development work for Firestone. Chaparral's understanding of vehicle dynamics grew alongside its understanding of tire technology. Now, none of that would have been possible without the great minds of Jim Hall and his partner Hap Sharp, both of whom pioneered additional innovations in the racing world. One of the initial problems with the Scarab-based Chaparrals was the fact that the air was pushing the nose of the car upward. So for the Chaparral 2, Hall developed an air deflector under the nose to deflect lift. Also new for that car was the use of a fiberglass monocoque chassis developed with boat racing technology in mind. Then came the 2C, which introduced an adjustable rear wing that could be controlled via foot pedals in the car. That was totally possible since the semi-automatic transmission installed in the car didn't need a clutch pedal. The 2D and 2E were developed in tandem, the former for international endurance racing and the latter for the shorter distance 2-hour Can-Am races in America. The 2D was the first closed cockpit variant of the two, the one that won at the Nürburgring. The 2E, though, was a watershed. The 2C had shown that a rear wing could work, but the first version was not perfect. Because the 2C's wing was mounted to the bodywork, Hall found that the whole car would bottom out on the track when he enacted extra downforce, while the front end would lift up. On the 2E, the wing was mounted to the rear wheel hubs, pushing all of that downforce directly onto the tires to keep the car more balanced. The wing, mounted 3 feet above the body of the car in order to better manage lift, added downforce that was equaled by a throttle valve at the front of the car that helped equal out the downforce pressure between front and rear. And by adding radiators to the sides of the car, Hall created a better center of gravity and also avoided creating an ultra-hot footwell that sapped the strength from the drivers during races as their feet slowly cooked in the car. The 2F improved on the 2E in one important way. It added a front downforce modulation device in the form of a spring-loaded door inside an airspeed pressurized chamber behind the front air inlet. Increased speed and max downforce configuration, and the air pressure partially opens that little door, reducing front downforce. The driver could also fully open the door on corners. Paired with the rotation of the wing, the car was absurdly balanced. The 2G was the version of the 2E with wider tires. Replacing the 2G was the 2H, which was designed with a sleek shape to reduce drag created by wing-induced downforce. However, drivers had to sit so low in the cockpit that Chaparral needed to add translucent panels to the sides of the car for visibility. Driver John Surtees was still not happy and asked for a full redesign that demolished any aerodynamic advantage the car would have had. So, it looked gorgeous, but it lacked on the performance side of things. Then came the 2J. But before we completely get there, let me catch you up on what was going on in the Can-Am world during the sport's first few years of existence. In 1966, the Can-Am's inaugural season, John Surtees took the title in a Lola T70 Mark II in what proved to be a huge success. Drivers loved the series, and teams around the world began looking into the costs of competing and building a car just for Can-Am racing. In 1967, one of those teams was the inimitable McLaren. Yes, the outfit helmed by Kiwi Bruce McLaren had competed in 1966, but its performance left a lot to be desired. The McLaren M6A, introduced for 1967, was a watershed. While the car didn't introduce any groundbreaking new pieces of technology, the McLaren outfit had mastered the art of refining already existing tech into something that was as beautiful as it was fast. McLaren didn't have anything special compared to anyone else, it just did everything better. In 1967, we saw the beginning of what came to be called the Bruce and Denny Show, where Bruce McLaren and teammate Denny Hulme seemed unstoppable. One of the two swept every single race in 1967 with the exception of the finale, which was won by John Surtees. Bruce McLaren took the title. In 1968, it was Hulme's turn. Again, McLaren dominated, but 2 of the 6 race victories were snatched up, first by Mark Donohue and then John Cannon. In '69, McLaren won everything. It won every single race. Heading into 1970, defending champion Bruce McLaren was killed testing a new car, but the team honored his legacy by once again sweeping all but one race. McLaren's mindset that it would primarily innovate on already existing technology contributed to its success. The team instituted very minor but effective alterations from one season to the next, resulting in reliable and well-understood cars. It was the exact opposite of the Chaparral team, which brought brand new cars to Can-Am every single year, each one drastically different from the next. And its 1970 challenger, the 2J, would be wilder than anything that had come before it. Sometime in 1967, a fan letter arrived in Midland, Texas, that contained an illustration drawn by a young child. It showed a Chaparral fitted with a massive fan, like a helicopter rotor. The child suggested that perhaps instead of using the rotor to generate lift, you could use it to generate downforce. Actually adding a rotor was not going to be the way to go, since it added a lot of weight for very little payoff. But it did get Hall thinking. Rather than trying to manage airflow to create downforce, why not just generate your own low-pressure area with fans, like a vacuum? I was probably inspired by the giant hovercraft that ferried people and cars back and forth across the English Channel, Hall said, reported in his latest biography, Texas Legend. The fans of the hovercraft forced air to lift the ship's hull out of the water. Turn that around, though, and you should theoretically be able to generate heaps of downforce. This is the introduction of ground effect in motorsport. The benefits of this technology were huge. First and foremost, a vacuum would mean the Chaparral would not have to worry too much about creating downforce via wings or other appendages stuck into the car. Those appendages, on top of being fragile, also generated a lot of drag. Secondly, a giant fan could generate downforce regardless of how fast the car was going. You could be driving 2 miles per hour and the fans would still suck it to the pavement. A lot of people at this time also said basically, if you were to put the Chaparral upside down on the ceiling, it would stick there and it wouldn't even have to be moving. At the same time, Jim Hall and Don Gates had conducted parametric studies in Midland to quantify the opportunity full-time downforce presented, and the report proved one big thing. Using appendages like wings to generate downforce meant the ability to generate that downforce was inherently limited because the appendages relied on speed. Hall said, with fan-powered ground effect, at least in theory, you could have the right amount of downforce in any situation, something that had never been possible before. He further explained, what I realized was that net downforce was a pretty remarkable thing, and if you could keep improving it, you're going to go faster and faster. So while the Chaparrals may look different from one another, each one included, among other things, an attempt to take the next step in net downforce from the one before. After a disastrous 1969 Can-Am season came to a close, Hall attempted to further refine the 2H until Chevy R&D called. The General Motors team had already been considering Hall's idea for the 2J, and they found that it worked. See, GM started with its suspension test vehicle, on which it mounted low, wide plywood floors across the midsection to create 2 flat panels on either side of the cockpit. On each panel was a vertically mounted fan that sucked air from under the car. And even though it was crude, it worked. It created a vacuum under the car, and when they tested it on the skid pad, Don Cox of GM remembers, it didn't matter what the driver did. He couldn't break the thing loose. He couldn't make it slide sideways. GM got permission to develop a fully functional fan car from the ground up, if only to serve as a kind of demonstration vehicle showing off the potential of ground effect, and later, to use that kind of car to further advance tire technology. But shortly after the project got underway, GM started cracking down on racing again, and this sucker car was deemed an offender. Rather than send it to the crusher or the scrap heap, Chevy R&D asked Jim Hall if they could send him the car. It also asked if he'd field a Camaro racing program in the Trans Am series as a little favor. Hall, ever loyal, agreed, but attempting to build 2 racing cars, one featuring a completely unheard of concept in the motorsport world, at the same time, really put a damper on the efforts of both. The ground effect car that arrived in Midland was basically just a tub and some body pieces. There was no engine, dashboard, or transmission, and the fans hadn't even been installed. Hall remembers seeing the bits and pieces of the machine when it arrived at his shop, saying, "It was a basic chassis and some body parts. They borrowed some of the parts that we designed for the H, the wheels, the spindles, the front uprights, so the suspension layout was similar to what we'd been using, but it was far from a complete car. A lot of it still needed to be designed, built, and installed before it could become operational, much less something you would take to a racetrack." It took Hall a while to start work on what would become the 2J for just that reason. It was nowhere near ready to hit the track, and he already had a car, the 2H, to improve on. But Chaparral got started figuring out what work it would need to do on the 2J anyway. They'd need to expand the suction zone from the center of the car to encompass both the front and the rear. They'd need to move the fans, adapted from a military tank engine, to the rear of the car and find a way to power them, perhaps with some go-kart or snowmobile engines. The bottom of the chassis needed to be lined with Lexan plastic skirts so they could seal to the ground when the fans were in action. You were always conservative at first because you tried to drive it at the limit, but you couldn't make yourself do it, Hall told George Levy and Texas legend, referring to his first outings behind the wheel of the 2J. You were not used to being able to pull 1.6G or 2G stopping or whatever. I had the same conversation with the guys that drove it in the races for us, and they all said the same thing. You'd drive it as deep as you think you could go in a corner and put on the brakes. And then you'd realize you were too slow for the corner. Even with the engine turned off, it's said that the Chaparral 2J can travel forward at anywhere from 25 to 40 miles per hour. Of course, though, there were problems. During a test, a radiator hose blew and filled the cockpit with boiling water. Hall, who was driving the car, was still recovering from a nasty accident that had left him unable to use his legs to their fullest. He couldn't push himself up off of the seat, and as a result, the skin on his rear end boiled right off. It took weeks for Hall to heal, long weeks where no one was allowed in the room with him lest they bring with them an infection. Then GM delivered its Camaros late, which meant Chaparral got a late start preparing for Trans Am. A young, promising mechanic then was killed making a parts run for the team. And during a test run, a driver crashed the 2H beyond repair. Plus, their 2J was still of questionable legality. See, nothing in the international rulebook by which Can-Am operated, Appendix J of the Group 7 regulations, outright banned ground effect. It did ban suspension-mounted wings and aerodynamic devices after some nasty accidents took place in Formula One resulting from those components. To find out for sure, Hall called up the SCCA. It was obvious at this point that the 2J had huge potential, so when I started thinking about turning it into a race car, I talked to the SCCA technical people about it to make sure that we weren't wasting our time, Hall said. When I got an approval from them, that's when I was fully on board with developing the car into a raceable state for the upcoming Can-Am season. SCCA technical representatives investigated the car in person and agreed it was legal. Hall and Chaparral got to work, but resources were slim. They were taking on the Trans Am season in full force, and sponsorship had dried up over the years, reducing their budget. They had plenty of problems to solve and very little ways to go about solving them. But testing proved that there was potential. Drivers like Vic Elford would say that the Chaparral 2J didn't actually feel particularly fast, that it wasn't a particularly exciting car to drive. At least, not until you climbed out of the cockpit to discover that you'd gone around the corners faster than any other car ever would have. As word began to spread about this exceptional vehicle, people got excited. Can-Am itself even was making promotional films of the 2J featuring its series spokesperson Sterling Moss. The team engaged in tons of promotion before the car debuted, hoping to drum up sponsorship. But before the car even ran, some folks could see the writing on the wall. The first paragraph of a Corvette news story about the 2J read, "The car you see on these pages is perhaps the most incredible race car ever designed and built. It's the new Chaparral 2J. It promises to revolutionize everyone's ideas about race cars. Unless, of course, some spoil sports get together and ban it." They were prophetic words. When the 1970 Can-Am season rolled around, it was clear that there was still a lot of work to be done on the Chaparral 2J. Rather than try to debut a car at the first race of the season, Chaparral held off until it felt it was ready, which didn't happen until Watkins Glen. There, Jim Hall had secured an exceptional driving talent to showcase the 2J. He had signed Jackie Stewart. In 1970, Stewart was already a Formula One champion, but he had lucrative contracts with Ford and Dunlop. Still, he was able to finagle a deal that allowed him to race with the Chevrolet-powered Firestone-shod Chaparral team for just one Can-Am race, because he had that kind of power. It was a risky move for the safety-conscious Stewart, but he had implicit trust in Jim Hall, saying in Texas Legends, Jim was a much more robust engineer. What Colin Chapman and Brabham and these guys did at the time was just papier-mâché. Stewart didn't have time to test the car before it arrived at Watkins Glen, and it was there that he was forced to get used to its noise, its left foot braking, its strange transmission, and so much more. In qualifying, he brought the car home third, though he felt he could have taken pole position. The car's traction, its ability to brake and go deeply into the corners, is something I've never experienced before in a car this size or bulk, Stewart wrote in his book Faster. Its adhesion is such that it seems unable to take unorthodox racing lines through the turns, and this, of course, is intriguing. But there were still problems. The car sucked in dirt, which disrupted the belts and resulted in auxiliary engines overheating. Its engine dropped one of its 2 cylinders early in the race, vapor lock forced a pit stop on lap 15, and the brakes finally failed 7 laps later. Still, Stewart managed to set the fastest lap in the race. As the Scottish racer put it, the Chaparral 2J was the beginning of a new era in motor racing. Stewart would never again appear behind the wheel of the 2J, and the team had to sideline the car for the subsequent 3 races to work through some teething problems. When it next hit the track again for the last 4 Can-Am events of the year, Vic Alford served as its pilot. The driver was a good choice. He was smart and analytical, adept at giving feedback. Hall approached him immediately after the Watkins Glen race, and Alford got to work testing right away. When the 2J returned to the track again, it was at Road Atlanta, where the car instantly demolished the competition in terms of speed. Alford had set a 1 minute 17.42 seconds to McLaren racer Denny Hulme's 1 minute 18.68 seconds. And with 30 minutes still remaining in the session, Alford didn't bother going out to set a faster time. It was the first non-McLaren pole position for 3 years. Reflecting on the event, Alford recalled, "It sort of dawned on us in Atlanta, where it probably didn't at Rattlesnake, that it actually really was, for reasons we really didn't quite understand, a hell of a lot quicker than anything else." Outfitted with a 3-speed torque converter, the 2J was generally a lot slower off the starting line than the competition, but in the race it didn't take long for Alford to catch up. Within the first few laps, he'd passed Denny Hulme and Peter Gethin's McLarens, as well as Peter Revson's Lola. Alford recalled, "On the first lap, when we got round to the other end of Road Atlanta, between turn 6 and 7, I came through turn 6 on Peter's gearbox, sort of looking to the inside, not thinking for one moment that I would actually go by. And then suddenly he was braking. My thought was, well, that's just unfortunate. He must have broken something. But in fact, no. He was just braking at his normal spot. And then in my Chaparral, I wasn't even close to thinking about putting on the brakes. So I braked there and passed him. And then I did it again in the next couple of laps with the 2 McLarens and just drove away." Unfortunately, the engine and the ground effect couldn't last the full race distance, leaving Alford to finish 6th. Still, it's hard to fully express how monumental the performance at Road Atlanta was. No one had been able to compete with the McLarens for almost the entire duration of Can-Am's existence. And suddenly, here was this shocking piece of technology blowing them out of the water. At Laguna Seca, Alford, who had never driven the track before, was the only driver to qualify for the race with a time under a minute. The next day, he demolished McLaren's 1969 track record. In the McLaren camp, Teddy Mayer called a closed-door meeting. Afterward, he told reporters that he felt the 2J was, quote, fairly illegal as far as the FIA rules are concerned, but not illegal the way the SCCA has interpreted them. Eric Broadley of Lola was a lot less generous. He said, "The car is definitely illegal, no matter what the SCCA says. But then, this is an American series, and you have to go along with the organizers, don't you?" During warm-up on race day, the 2J threw a rod and couldn't start the event, but the backlash against it was already huge. It forced Chaparral Chief Vehicle Engineer Don Gates to hold a press conference, where he offered some of the most incredible words in motorsport. Let me quote his concise but powerful statement. The original concept of the Can-Am series was to provide one race series with an absolute minimum of rules to promote engineering innovations. Jim Hall's Chaparral cars is the only entrant that has attempted to fulfill this concept to any degree. Our detractors say that we are not within the spirit of the rules. We contend that they are not within the spirit of the Can-Am series. In the 6-week gap between Laguna Seca and Riverside, Teddy Mayer and Eric Broadley scheduled a meeting with the SCCA to take place after the event, where they would ask for a reinterpretation of the rules in order to end the ground effect era. In effect, to outright ban the technology that the SCCA had previously deemed legal. At Riverside, Alfred smashed the track record by 1.5 seconds and outqualified second-place starter Denny Hulme by 2. Alfred recalled the session in a vivid way that suggests just how frustrated the McLaren camp had become. Once again, I was blowing everybody away in practice, Alfred said. At one point, I came down turn 9, the long, slightly banked 180-degree corner before the pits. It was just a long corner, and you sort of stayed in the middle of the road and then made an apex toward the end of it. I came into the corner right behind Denny, and he was following his normal line around. I simply drove all the way around on the outside of him and past him. When we got to the end of the corner, he didn't even bother to carry on. He just drove straight into the pits, got out of the car, took his helmet off, slammed it on the counter, and just sat there and sulked for the rest of the session. But again, in the race itself, the 2J's engine failed. All weekend long, the SCCA had heard arguments both for and against the 2J in order to determine its legality. The Chaparral team, meanwhile, announced its intention to race the 2J again in 1971, and by then, it presumably would have been a much improved car with all of those kinks worked out. But no one expected the SCCA to allow the team to field it. Many Chaparral team members left in anticipation of that ruling, only for the SCCA to announce on November 30th that the Chaparral 2J was legal and would be allowed to compete in the 1971 season. There was just one caveat. The SCCA couldn't make that decision on its own. In order to add regulations that would firmly allow the 2J to compete, the SCCA needed sign-off from both the Automobile Competition Committee for the United States, or ACUS, and the FIA. Even though the SCCA was theoretically its own distinct organization, the fact that Can-Am borrowed from international rule sets meant that it was still beholden to other powers when it came to changing those rules. The 2J's opposition moved quickly, and a week before Christmas, a new ruling came to light courtesy of the FIA's Commission Sportive Internationale, or the CSI, which established the racing rules that the FIA enforced. Its ruling read, "Ground effects systems and auto racing applications do not comply to International Sporting Commission rules. Appendix J clearly specifies that any specific part of the car which has an aerodynamic influence on the stability of the vehicle must compulsorily be fitted on the entirely sprung part of the car and be firmly fixed while the car is in motion. Consequently, the device such as currently conceived cannot be considered as complying with Appendix J, owing to the presence of mobile parts, propellers and plastic curtains ensuring contact with the ground." While some ACUS members disagreed with the ruling, saying that Group 7 racing based on Appendix J regulations should allow for maximum design freedom, there was no way to change the FIA's mind. It had decisively stepped in to end development of the 2J, and the decision scared officials of the United States Auto Club so badly that USAC also preemptively banned ground effect cars in Champ Car racing and at the Indy 500. The 2J, for all intents and purposes, was dead. After years of time and effort and money and blood and sweat and tears, Jim Hall stepped back from motorsport. He was done. From my point of view, it was pretty dramatic, Hall said, of the banning of the 2J, and it was devastating for our race team. 3 in a row. We got the wing disallowed, We spent a considerable amount of money and effort trying to run the big international sports car races, and after Ford was so successful, I think the FIA or the Europeans just decided we'll go back to not running big stock blocks. So that put us out of that series. And then, of course, when I went ahead and finished up the ground effect car, they disallowed it too. Hall admitted that he thought the technology would have been banned at some point anyway, if only for the fact that the increased speeds would introduce increased dangers to drivers and spectators. However, he continued, I just think it would have been a more equitable kind of arrangement if they had said, hey, this thing's going to get out of control in a year or two. That's it, we're going to quit after that. At least give us a little bit of time to make something out of what we'd gone to the trouble to do. That was, after all, what Can-Am was supposed to be about. Breaking boundaries, innovating, spending the time and money and brain power to outrun the other guys who were spending time and money and brain power to outrun you. Instead, the decisive FIA ruling neutered the entire premise of the series. If the FIA would run Jim Hall out of Can-Am Racing for daring to do something different, then why should anyone else sacrifice the resources necessary to do something genuinely interesting and new? As far as we were concerned, there really wasn't anywhere for us to go, Hall said. He noted that he was committed to developing ground effect, but, quote, we got it all taken away. He continued, I completely lost interest in racing. I devoted my time and effort to do this, and I wound up in a blind alley. Looking back on the decision that he helped spearhead, Denny Hulme even admitted that banning the 2J, quote, was the most stupid thing we ever did, and it was the first major step we took toward killing off the greatest road racing series ever conceived. Robin Hurd of the March Racing team told Road and Track in early 1971 that Hall's departure from the series, quote, undermined the series enormously. It was still a very credible series, but he and General Motors added so much to it. It was never really the same. When it became clear that the Can-Am series would be dictated by a specific set of rules, manufacturers changed tactics. In 1971, after the series received official FIA recognition, McLaren continued its domination for the 5th straight season. But in 1972, something changed. Years previously, Porsche came to Can-Am and said it wanted to utilize turbocharged versions of its 917 racer in the series, and it secured the guarantee that this technology wouldn't be banned. When Jim Kaiser, one of the original architects of the Can-Am series, traveled to Stuttgart to see the engine Porsche had created, he remembers thinking, oh my God, this is the end of Can-Am. Kaiser left the sport soon after his visit, unwilling to see what Can-Am would become. As he explained later, people weren't going to run in a race where they had no hope of winning. The series had ultimately bound its own hands, though. After Hull was forced out of the sport, Can-Am required 3 years' notice before it could implement any serious regulation changes. Turbocharging, while theoretically disallowed, wasn't explicitly banned. Any regulations to ban turbocharged engines wouldn't come into effect until after Porsche could legally enter the series. Kaiser had no choice but to approve it at the time. And so in 1972, Porsche came, partnered up with Roger Penske. It dominated for 2 straight years. Ultimately, it left before the 1974 season, but the prospect of watching an exceptional driver like Mark Donohue race a Porsche drew record-breaking crowds all year long. But that momentum didn't last. In the autumn of 1973, the United States faced an energy crisis as oil costs skyrocketed. The country had aided Israel in an attack against Syrian and Egyptian forces during the Yom Kippur War. As a result, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, or OPEC, raised the cost of a barrel of oil and implemented embargoes on the United States. Highway speeds were dropped to 55 miles per hour, and many motorsport events were canceled outright. A stock market downturn only intensified the hesitance to go racing. The 1974 Can-Am season, then, was understandably shattered. The season whittled down to just 5 events, and all of the big-name manufacturers and sponsors packed up and left after the series declared it would be run on a fuel efficiency formula, where every team would be given a certain amount of fuel and would then have to run all weekend with that allotment. The field was composed entirely of customer cars, and the factory effort of the Shadow team. Jackie Oliver of Shadow won the title. As the years had passed, so too did many of Hall's general frustrations with motorsport. In 1974, when Lola importer Carl Haas reached out to Jim Hall about going open-wheel racing, the man from Midland, Texas, signed on. There, though, Hall wasn't designing new cars so much as he was a team manager dictating the preparation of Formula 5000 machines and later on, Indy cars. He helped design the race-winning Chaparral 2K that was based on Colin Chapman's Lotus 78, and thanks to its Pennzoil sponsorship scheme, it quickly earned the nickname the Yellow Submarine. In 1980, Johnny Rutherford piloted the car to both an Indy 500 win and a kart championship. It was an immense achievement to tick off his bucket list. Hall participated in the sport on and off from that point until 1996, when he ultimately retired from racing. For good this time, and under less frustrating circumstances. More than anything else, I think the story of the Chaparral 2J's untimely death at the hands of the FIA perfectly illustrates something we see time and again throughout motorsport history. America tends to be seen as an unruly child that needs saving from itself, courtesy of the sage wisdom of Europe. In many ways, the Canadian-American Challenge Cup could never have continued to exist based on the guiding principles that had brought it into being in the first place. The dream of a series loaded to the gills with unregulated sports cars was beautiful in a brute force kind of way, but it wasn't sustainable. Bigger budget teams like McLaren or Porsche could turn up, spend tons of money, and push every other competitor into a completely different class. Or scrappier teams like the Chaparral could turn up with an earth-shattering ground effect technology and force everyone to completely pivot from their original design goals. In both cases, we would have inevitably seen the series burn out, either because everyone ran out of money or because the cars had become dangerous jet planes with wheels. However, because the powers that be in the series never really addressed those concerns with its competitors, and because so much of the decision-making was done behind closed doors, sudden decisions, like the banning of the Chaparral 2J, were particularly frustrating and felt like they came out of nowhere. But the series and its competitors didn't get a chance to come to that conclusion themselves. Instead, the FIA stepped in and decisively killed off a car that had threatened to outshine anything that had ever turned laps in directly FIA-sanctioned series. I'm sure that sounds hyper-American of me, but I think many of my fellow American motorsport fans would agree that they have, at some point or another, felt as if they'd been looked down upon by continental motorsport. It's an insidious mindset that comes in a lot of forms, telling us that oval racing isn't real racing, that our open-wheel competition isn't serious, that our sports car racing is somehow lesser, that our uniquely American sports don't mean anything. As we've seen in this episode, Jim Hall was told his big, powerful engines wouldn't work, that his aerodynamic innovations meant nothing in the face of established European might, that his technologies were only relevant when they were introduced by someone in, say, the Formula One world. For me, one of the coolest parts of American motorsport history is that it is kind of scrappy. Our racing history is all about making do. When America wasn't producing any low-slung sports cars, we imported them from Europe. When we realized they didn't achieve the feats we wanted them to, we stuck our big American engines in them and tore up the bodywork and tinkered with the suspension until we had our own home-built special. You could turn up at the Indy 500 with an outdated car and a dream because there was a good chance you could figure out how to make it faster in your home garage. You could develop a record-breaking jet car, and you could do it out of a bunch of random things you found in a military surplus junkyard. But I think historically, so much of the racing rhetoric we consumed in America came from Europe, so it took us a while to realize that we could just build a car. We didn't need to rely on Lotus or Cooper to sell us an outdated machine that we could fix up. We could just parse a rulebook ourselves and build something new. And if we felt like we were limited by someone else's rulebook, we could come up with our own series where the only rules were that you had to be safe. That's an intoxicating mindset. It's also a threatening one. European motorsport likes its rules. It likes complexity and nuance and procedure. And even when you consider something like the early years of Formula One, you can see how continental mindsets were forced to evolve when British teams came into the fold with their new ideas and a fresh take on car building. The Alfa Romeos, Ferraris, Maseratis, and Tabalagos suddenly had to pay attention to these home-built Coopers and Lotuses because they were showing up at their races and kicking their butts. Eventually, the persistence of British innovation forced the tides of continental motorsport to change. But even then, there were still a lot of rules and regulations. They just kind of changed authors. But I think because of the physical gap between the US and its overseas peers, our racing mindsets branched off in a totally incomprehensible way, at least as far as British and European motorsport was concerned. When you have the freedom to just throw anything at the wall and see what sticks, it can also appear to outsiders that you're just descending into chaos. It would be easy to think you could perhaps bring your team or your series or your sanctioning body over to the United States to do some racing, and your adherence to your certain way of doing things would prove you instantly better than everyone else. In Can-Am, you could make an argument that that was kind of true, considering how McLaren came in and dominated. But I would also argue that the mindset discounts the extremely cool stuff a lot of American engineers and team owners were playing with at the time. We were figuring out a lot of crazy concepts and engaging in mind-boggling innovation. But in a lot of ways, we were outthinking and overextending ourselves. At its peak, the Chaparral team really only had 20 employees, while a McLaren or a Porsche inevitably had far more people dedicated to their programs. Those overseas outfits innovated by small degrees. In Texas, Jim Hall was introducing a radically new car every year. It was audacious, but that kind of audacity can't really exist for long. It makes sense that Can-Am had to implement rules. It makes sense that greater European participation encouraged those rules. It also makes sense that when some seriously groundbreaking innovation was taking place, that Europe would step in to effectively squash that innovation in the bud. It's just deeply unfortunate that that's how it had to happen, and that we never truly could have seen what Jim Hall could have done with the Chaparral 2J. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next one, we'll be delving into the life of Roberta Cowell, the first openly transgender person who had competed in motorsport in the United Kingdom. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts and newsletters, and if you want to send an email, I have an address for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. I also want to extend a huge thank you to my two DPTJ world champions, Ryan Lorman and Nicole Washington. These icons have been battling it out all season to see who can become the most iconic member of the DPTJ family, and I have to say, they're pretty neck and neck. To both Ryan and Nicole, thank you so much for your ongoing support. Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys could not exist without the kindness and generosity of people like you. I also want to read a great comment I received from 3 Cat Antics, who left a great message on the YouTube video for my previous episode about the 1977 Firecracker 400. They wrote, "Nice job with this video. Hopefully we can learn from history and make the sport better." 3 Cat Antics, that is exactly my goal for the show. Finally, don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel. The Indy 500 may be in the rearview mirror, but it's never too early to start prepping your wardrobe for next year. Make sure to check out the link in my bio for updates, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, We are ending with Le Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each episode. You can also find the full list of sources in the description. My primary source for this episode is a new Jim Hall biography titled Texas Legend, Jim Hall and His Chaparrals by George Levy. The book took several years to write, and Levy conducted over 130 interviews to flesh out every detail of the Chaparral story. It's a fantastic read for anyone who wants to delve a little deeper into the mind of a man who developed some of the wildest race cars of all time. I also referenced Can-Am by Pete Lyons and Can-Am 50th Anniversary, Flat Out with North America's Greatest Race series by George Levy, as well as a handful of online sources that I'll link in the description. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll see you next time.